Google's reputation is a tricky thing to get your head around. Back in the early days of the internet, they were just one thing. The geeky, awkward internet guys with a catchy motto who helped you find stuff in the cyber realm. They were internet librarians. But then fast forward a few years though, and while I still kind of see them as fun and friendly, things are a bit more complicated.
Sexual misconduct by senior executives.
Tax evasion that the people are angry about.
They're listening all the time.
And sure, we could argue about whether some controversy is normal for a ridiculously huge behemoth, or if it's blown out of proportion, or if, like Steve Jobs once said, "Don't be evil" was bullshit all along. But in any case, it's almost strange to step back and realize just how much Google's reputation has changed. All of a sudden, my friendly neighborhood librarian is also my mailman, and my internet service provider, and my personal assistant who lives on my couch. And in a sense, it feels a bit creepy and all-pervasive, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. As we dive into a future of increasingly complicated tech, getting the convenient benefits that we want probably means trusting capable and experienced experts, potentially Google, to do lots of new work that we don't necessarily understand.
And that, more than anything, is what makes the Sidewalk project so fascinating. It's our librarian putting on another hat as a city planner.
And it might be the perfect time to investigate how and if the goals of a private corporation can align with the public good. It's worth pointing out that Sidewalk Labs is technically their own company, but the money comes from their rich business uncle Google, which is how they're able to afford the $1.3 billion price tag of their first major project, this futuristic redevelopment of Toronto's derelict waterfront. And it means the two are essentially the same. So you can sort of see why a lot of the news coverage has been kind of hysterical. Google's massive, and if they're successful here, they'll become even bigger and more influential. But this video isn't about the evils of Google, it's about understanding what's happening here. Google's size and reputation mean that for better or for worse, Sidewalks is going to become a model for future cities. Which has implications for the whole dang world. As the architect and urban designer Peter Calthorpe put it,
fundamentally, the way we shape cities is a manifestation of the kind of humanity we bring to bear.
So let's take a deep dive and explore what Google's after here. What's in it for Toronto and for other cities down the line.
So in a lot of ways, a project like this has a lot to offer a city. The world is urbanizing incredibly fast. The UN estimates that by 2050, 70% of us will live in a city, which is a lot of growth really quickly. And like London in the Industrial Revolution or me going through puberty, cities like Toronto are struggling to cope with the change, like congestion or increased housing costs or inequality. So there's a case to be made that some of these problems could be solved with an increased focus on high technology. So getting the help of a team like Google could be incredibly valuable. They've got this technical expertise that public officials just might not.
How does that show up on a 7-year-old's iPhone who's playing a kid's game?
Congressman, iPhone is made by a different company.
So right away, that's a pretty good argument for Google's involvement. Toronto gets valuable assistance in a complicated area from a genuine expert. But there is a flip side. Admitting your own lack of knowledge and then bringing in a big flashy expert sometimes means you get bullied.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
So for example, back in 2017, Toronto put out a request for bids to redevelop about 12 acres of land along the waterfront. Google won the project and then as a super fun secret added bonus feature came back with a plan for like 193 acres of basically new city. Which in a way is definitely exciting because it's far more ambitious than the city anticipated, but on the other hand, isn't what the city, and therefore the people, actually asked for. That expansion in scope has proven pretty controversial, and in response, Sidewalk's CEO Dan Doctoroff said, "We just don't think that 12 acres on Quayside has the scale to actually have the impact on affordability and economic opportunity in transit." Which, you know, sure. But you can see why people are upset. After being sold a vision that looks like the Jetsons, it feels a bit like a bait and switch to now say they can only do what they pitched if they're given a bit more. And you can kind of see how Google overreached just in the sheer size of the proposal physically. It's a 1,500-page document, which is essentially the size of The Lord of the Rings plus The Hobbit, and makes this project essentially inaccessible for most people because very, very, very few of us have the time to read J.R.R. Tolkien's city development plan. Most bystanders aren't going to have the knowledge to have an intelligent debate about this, which is important, because what Google's proposing goes so far beyond the usual relationships that a city would have with a supplier. So, for example, the plan anticipates a future where single car ownership is replaced slowly by ride-sharing, autonomous cars, and active transportation like walking and cycling. That means trading parking for public spaces and more funding for things like bike lanes. While underground, they build a network of tunnels and logistics hubs which allow deliveries and trash collection to happen underground, taking even more vehicles off the road. And that's amazing stuff. As noted by Peter Calthorpe in that TED Talk I referenced earlier, Designing cities for localization like this has a couple benefits, like bringing down carbon emissions and improving respiratory health and actually lowering household costs as well. But that's just the mobility section, and again, this plan is pretty comprehensive, and maybe the most exciting part of it is the series of nearly carbon-neutral, high-rise commercial and residential buildings they plan to construct out of frickin' wood, like a collective of engineering school beavers. Wood that would be sourced sustainably from a Google-created factory in northern Ontario and then shipped down to where the buildings themselves would then be designed and constructed with a series of features like high-performance windows and airtight seals that would limit their energy consumption. In the end, the project would provide nearly 5,000 new units of residential space in a city that's desperate for housing. But they'll also immediately make Google one of Toronto's 10 biggest developers. And it's a little strange for a developer to have such a big influence on the city being built around it. Which brings me to maybe their biggest ask: extending Toronto's very controversial LRT network to service the neighborhood. That alone would cost $1.5 billion on top of the $1.3 billion that Sidewalks has already committed to the neighborhood. And Sidewalks isn't offering to put up that $1.5 billion. In the words of Sidewalk CEO Dan Doctoroff, if we have any hope of achieving Waterfront Toronto's priority objectives, you have to have mass transit to serve it. That one quote uses very specific language that tells you a lot about why people are upset about the Google project. The good Doctoroff mentions Waterfront Toronto's priority objectives, a list of crucial goals the organization laid out in their original request for proposals. And by mentioning them in the same breath as a demand for more funding, he's doing something pretty shady. Because those objectives are absolutely essential to the project. They're the whole reason it exists in the first place. But Doctoroff seems to be suggesting that if Google doesn't get what it wants, they might not adhere to those objectives. Which comes across as arrogant and oddly threatening, especially since Google's whole proposal hinges on being given preferred rates on the land based on perceived added value that they'll give to the project later on. Google's essentially arguing that they should pay less now because Toronto will benefit so much in the future. The former Alphabet chairman Eric Schmidt described it as
a global draw for new ideas for economic growth and development.
And that's the thing, the proposal loudly trumpets job creation and GDP growth, and it promises to be green as hell. And all that's enough to make any city official fall in love. But it's a little weird when you consider how hesitant Doctoroff and his cohorts are to actually commit to firm promises. And so again, that quote only refers to the LRT, which is one small component of the puzzle, but it brings up something interesting. If those non-negotiable objectives become even partially negotiable, what's the point of this project for Toronto? So that being said, provided the project does actually go ahead the way it's planned and Google follows through the way they ought to, there are some obvious benefits for the city. But as we mentioned, there is a fair amount of overreaching on the part of Google. So let's look what's in it for them. So obviously, figuring out what brings Sidewalks and Google to Toronto would make a pretty awful episode of, say, Sherlock. They're profit-based corporations, and in the words of Dan Doctoroff, they're here to make money. To that end, the proposal lists a dozen possible revenue streams, which break down simply into real estate, infrastructure investment, and intellectual property. Honestly, the real estate venture and the infrastructure stuff alone could be solid cash cows. Just being a landlord on such valuable land would be a money machine. Or they could make a ton of money from their proposed timber factory if the beaver-style buildings catch on and other developers want to try it too. There's also the somewhat dubious scheme they've cooked up to get a cut of future tax revenue from the area once their development has theoretically increased the value of the land. So pause a second. Before we move on to the more controversial conversation around data use, it's worth taking note of that. While most of us worry about fears of Big Brother, Google might really be experimenting with the possibility of becoming a bank for public infrastructure projects, which could be an insanely valuable business. And they've got the cash piles to do it. But in any case, all of that pales in terms of excitement and attention to their use of data. And maybe for good reason. If the plan goes ahead as Google proposed, they'll be collecting data in the most extreme way I can imagine. In public spaces, they'll have monitoring equipment on the curbs to monitor parking space and in the signal lights to help with traffic flow. There'll also be in the tiles of their so-called modular pavement. And they'll be in public benches and gardens and spaces so residents can see what's available. And look, all I'm going to say is that I realize Google's already getting your data, Facebook is too, I understand, but this is a new level.
In those gorgeous wooden buildings, even more sensors will keep track of energy use by residents and monitor their trash output, and just generally, it seems, keep a tab on almost everything that goes on.
And a lot of this is going to be monitored or enabled or connected to a series of planned apps and accounts.
And well, that's great because everyone wants more apps, and any more concerns about privacy are obviously going to be alleviated when residents read every single word of the terms and conditions. All this data seems like it would still give Google just like a tremendous amount of power.
I don't want to cast any doubts on the presumably nice folk over at Google, but it seems like they then have a basically limitless database to A, help them create new products themselves, and then B, sell that data as pure information to other entities who want to make products too. Google says not to worry about any of that.
And in fairness, they have what sounds like a decent plan to keep things in check. They say they'll anonymize any potentially revealing personal data, and then access to that data will be restricted by what's called a public data trust,
Which is essentially like a board of directors that will hold collective authority. Like the double key system that they do for a nuclear launch. And that's something. And they promise to make the data available to anyone who would want it, which I guess sounds like it would be a bad thing, but in theory is a good thing. They want any other company or any public interest to be able to use the same data that they do. So that's their answer. The data use will not be immoral because they, A, won't have access to too much personal data, and B, anything they have access to, everyone else will have access to as well. Which I guess is why so far they only have 2 separate spin-off companies whose business models will be directly related to selling this data. Replica is going to collect and package location data and info on transit usage to sell the city's planning transit systems, while Cord will sell data about parking space and tools to analyze road use that they say will help make pickup and drop-off more predictable, dynamic, and productive for mobility companies like Uber or Lyft. So right away, all the sidewalks protest that, like, in theory, they're not going to be using personal data to make any money here, just kind of immediately seem ridiculous. And I'm not the only one who thinks so, by the way. Since their 1,500-page Lord of the Rings sequel came out, top privacy experts from around the world have been publicly shaming Google and Sidewalks for their laissez-faire attitude to data protection and privacy. And that list even includes Anne Cavoukian, the former Ontario Privacy Commissioner and a former advisor to Sidewalks, who quit the project citing concerns about potential data abuse and privacy. So without going further in the weeds, suffice to say there's real concern about privacy on this project. And again, it's still just a proposal. It's one that has a ton of momentum, but Cavoukian's resignation is part of a wave of strong backlash. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out. As we've seen, the benefits to Toronto are definitely there. It's just that they often carry risks and mitigating factors, which have a lot to do with the possible benefits that drew Google and Sidewalks in to begin with. So obviously that's not a comprehensive explanation of this complicated project, but I hope it's enough to spark a conversation. Because the questions that we have to ask about this project are questions that we should ask about the future of technology and cities in general. The tech world is only going to become more specialized, more confusing to a layman, and more remote from most of our everyday lives. And we increasingly rely on experts to fulfill our complex needs and fill that gap. And we trust them to do it ethically. So it's a question about the public good versus private interests, but it's also a question of nuance. The most malicious thing that Google does here is to suggest that we have to say yes to everything if we want anything. That's just not fair. We can create amazing, futuristic, sustainable wood neighborhoods full of autonomous cars and modular pavement, and we can do it without giving up the farm entirely to a company that hasn't necessarily earned our complete trust. In any case, the future of smart cities, whatever that means, is playing out in Toronto, and I, for one, am genuinely excited to see what happens next. Thanks for watching. This was episode 1 of Big Human Ideas.